the single biggest question hanging over this entire search, the one that has outlasted every theory, every failed dig, and every skeptic's dismissal, has finally been answered in this season's finale. This isn't a minor detail resolved along the way. It's the central question the whole show has circled since it began. This is Oak Island Season 13's finale, and it's built entirely around delivering that answer. What the question actually was and how the team finally settled it is what this hour covers. To understand how big this answer really is, it helps to revisit how long that question has gone unresolved. Identifying exactly what constitutes the biggest question of the Oak Island mystery requires some unpacking, since the search has generated numerous overlapping and interconnected questions across its more than 2-century history. Is it the question of who built the site's original features? The question of what the elaborate flood defenses were protecting? The question of whether any of this reflects deliberate human construction at all, rather than natural geological coincidence embellished by generations of storytelling? Season 13's own framing of this question, established explicitly in the season's opening episode, settled on a specific formulation. Is there physical evidence connecting Oak Island's construction to a documented historical group, or does the entire mystery remain, after more than 2 centuries of searching, fundamentally unattributable to any specific known historical actor? This framing represents a deliberate choice by the production team, distinguishing this specific question from the many related but distinct questions the show has investigated across its run. Rather than asking what treasure might be recovered or how the flooding mechanism functions, this season's central question focused on attribution. Can the team point to specific, verifiable evidence connecting the site's construction to an identifiable historical tradition, culture, or organization, rather than continuing to treat the builders as fundamentally anonymous and unknowable, as most previous seasons' findings have implicitly assumed? This question has particular resonance within the broader history of Oak Island research, since attribution has remained stubbornly elusive across more than 2 centuries of investigation, despite numerous competing theories proposing various historical groups as the site's original builders. Knights Templar theories, pirate theories, military engineering theories, and various other proposals have each had their advocates over the decades, but none has ever been definitively established through the kind of rigorous, verifiable physical evidence that would satisfy academic, historical, or archaeological standards, leaving the question of who built Oak Island as perhaps the single most persistent unresolved element of the entire mystery. Season 13's approach to finally resolving this question involved a coordinated effort spanning the season's various excavation locations, deliberately designed to gather physical evidence, construction technique data, and material composition information that could be cross-referenced against documented historical construction traditions from around the world. This approach required bringing together expertise from multiple disciplines: historical construction analysis, metallurgy, carbon dating, and comparative archaeology, coordinated by the same consulting historian whose work has featured prominently across several of this season's other investigative threads. The historian's methodology for this attribution question involved building a comprehensive database of construction techniques, toolmark patterns, and material compositions documented at historical sites, with confirmed attribution to specific historical groups or traditions, then systematically comparing evidence recovered from Oak Island across this season's various excavations against that database, searching for matches precise enough to support a confident attribution rather than the more circumstantial, symbolic comparisons that have characterized many previous attribution theories proposed across the show's history and in the broader community of Oak Island researchers. This systematic, database-driven approach represented a significant methodological departure from how attribution questions have typically been addressed on the show in previous seasons, which have more often relied on individual, isolated pieces of evidence, a symbol here, a coin there, interpreted somewhat speculatively as pointing toward a particular historical group, without the kind of comprehensive, comparative analysis this season's approach employed. Several members of the research team have described this shift as a direct response to years of academic criticism, suggesting the show's previous attribution theories relied too heavily on suggestive but ultimately inconclusive individual pieces of evidence. The comparative analysis process itself occupied a substantial portion of the season's research effort, running in parallel with the season's various excavation activities and drawing on evidence recovered from the Money Pit, Smith's Cove, the swamp, and the newly excavated sealed chamber discussed elsewhere in this season's coverage. As evidence accumulated from each of these locations, the historian's comparative database analysis gradually narrowed the range of plausible historical attributions, eliminating several previously popular theories whose predicted construction signatures failed to match the physical evidence being recovered across the season's various investigations. By the season's later episodes, this narrowing process had converged on a specific historical construction tradition, one the historian's analysis identified as showing the closest and most consistent match across multiple independently recovered pieces of evidence from different locations investigated this season. This convergence, rather than resting on a single isolated piece of evidence, drew strength precisely from its consistency across multiple independent excavation sites, a methodological approach that gives this season's attribution claim significantly more evidentiary weight than previous, more isolated attribution theories the show has explored in earlier seasons. The specific historical tradition this season's analysis points toward involves a documented medieval and early modern European construction and engineering practice, associated with fortification, concealment, and water management engineering, distinct from more popular but less evidentially supported theories that have circulated in Oak Island lore for generations. The historian has been careful to note that this attribution doesn't claim direct, unbroken continuity with any single named historical organization, but rather identifies a specific technical tradition and set of construction practices that this season's physical evidence consistently reflects. This more technically precise, less dramatically named attribution represents a deliberate departure from the show's history of flirting with more sensational, headline-friendly historical attributions in previous seasons. Several members of the production team have described this season's more measured, technically grounded attribution as a conscious choice to prioritize evidentiary rigor over dramatic narrative appeal, even at the risk of a less immediately exciting resolution than some viewers might have hoped for after years of speculation about more famous historical organizations potentially being responsible for the island's construction. Rick, discussing this season's attribution findings in interviews given ahead of the finale's broadcast, has emphasized that while this technical attribution might initially seem less dramatic than some of the more popularly circulated theories associated with Oak Island lore, it actually represents a more significant achievement precisely because it's grounded in verifiable, comparative physical evidence rather than the kind of circumstantial, symbolic reasoning that has characterized many previous, more sensational attribution theories. In his framing, a less dramatic but genuinely defensible answer represents real progress, where a more dramatic but evidentially unsupported claim would not. This finale's resolution of the attribution question doesn't claim to have identified every specific individual or organization involved in the site's original construction, nor does it claim to have determined precisely why this particular historical tradition chose Oak Island as a location for whatever elaborate concealment effort this construction ultimately served. What it does claim, based on the season's comprehensive comparative analysis, is that the site's construction can now be confidently associated with a specific, documented historical tradition, moving the broader mystery from a question of complete historical anonymity to one of narrower, more specific historical context. Skeptics and outside academic observers are likely to scrutinize this attribution claim carefully, given how central and consequential it is to the broader Oak Island narrative. The historian's comparative database analysis, while methodologically more rigorous than many previous attribution attempts, will require independent peer review and verification before it can be considered definitively established within the broader academic community studying historical construction techniques and their geographic and temporal distribution. Even with that necessary caveat, this finale represents the most methodologically rigorous attempt the show has made across its 13 seasons to address what has arguably been the single most persistent and consequential unresolved question in the entire Oak Island mystery. Not simply what might be buried on the island, but who, specifically, built the elaborate structures and defenses that have defeated generations of searchers for more than 2 centuries. Whether this season's answer ultimately holds up to the kind of sustained academic scrutiny that a claim of this significance will inevitably attract, it represents a genuine attempt to finally ground this central question in comparative, verifiable physical evidence, rather than continuing to leave it as an open, unanswerable mystery indefinitely. It's worth examining more closely how the historian's comparative database was actually constructed, since the credibility of this season's attribution claim rests heavily on the rigor of that underlying methodology. The database drew on published archaeological literature documenting construction techniques from historical sites, with confirmed academically established attribution spanning several centuries and multiple geographic regions associated with the broader medieval and early modern European construction tradition. The season's findings ultimately pointed toward. This wasn't a database built specifically for this show, but rather an adaptation of existing academic research the historian had access to through her broader professional work, giving the underlying comparative framework a foundation independent of the show's own production. The specific evidentiary categories this database tracked included timber joinery techniques, stoneworking toolmark patterns, and metallurgical composition signatures characteristic of specific historical periods and regions, each representing a distinct line of evidence that could independently either support or undermine any proposed attribution. This multi-category approach, rather than relying on any single type of evidence, was specifically designed to guard against the kind of coincidental, superficial matches that have sometimes misled previous attribution attempts in Oak Island research, where a single suggestive similarity has occasionally been overweighted relative to its actual evidentiary significance. Applying this multi-category comparative framework to evidence recovered across this season's various excavation sites required careful coordination between the historian and the excavation teams working simultaneously at the Money Pit, Smith's Cove, the swamp, and the newly accessed sealed chamber, ensuring that recovered material was properly catalogued, preserved, and made available for comparative analysis without compromising the archaeological integrity each individual excavation required. This coordination represented a significant logistical undertaking in its own right, requiring the historian to work closely with archaeological consultants at each excavation site throughout the season, rather than conducting her comparative analysis as a separate, disconnected research effort once excavation had already concluded. The convergence this analysis ultimately identified, with evidence from multiple independent excavation sites consistently pointing toward the same specific historical construction tradition, represents a particularly significant methodological achievement, precisely because of how unlikely such convergence would be if the underlying attribution were incorrect. Random chance alone would be highly unlikely to produce consistent matches across construction techniques, tool mark patterns, and material composition signatures spanning 4 distinct excavation sites. giving this season's attribution claim a statistical robustness that more isolated, single-site attribution attempts in previous seasons simply couldn't achieve. This statistical framing matters for understanding why the production team and the historian herself have expressed unusual confidence in this season's attribution findings relative to some of the show's previous, more speculative theories. Rather than resting on a single suggestive piece of evidence that skeptics could reasonably dismiss as coincidental or overinterpreted, this season's attribution claim draws its strength from the consistency of independent evidence recovered across multiple locations, each excavated and analyzed somewhat independently before the historian's comparative work identified the pattern connecting them. That said, the historian herself has been careful, in interviews given ahead of the finale's broadcast, to acknowledge the limitations of what comparative construction technique analysis can and cannot establish with certainty. Identifying a consistent match to a specific historical construction tradition doesn't, by itself, prove that specific individuals associated with that tradition were physically present on Oak Island, nor does it definitively rule out the possibility that construction knowledge could have been transmitted through indirect means, such as trained craftsmen who learned techniques from that tradition without being formally affiliated with any specific historical organization associated with it. This careful, appropriately hedged framing reflects the broader shift toward methodological rigor that has characterized much of Season 13's overall approach, distinguishing this season's attribution claim from the more confident, less qualified assertions that have sometimes characterized the show's engagement with historical attribution theories in earlier seasons. Whether this more careful, academically grounded approach ultimately satisfies viewers accustomed to more dramatic, definitive-sounding claims from previous seasons remains an open question that this finale's broadcast and subsequent audience reception will help answer. For a mystery that has generated more competing, unverifiable attribution theories than perhaps any other unresolved historical puzzle in North America, this season's methodologically rigorous, multi-site comparative analysis represents a genuine attempt to finally move the attribution question from the realm of speculation into something approaching, if not full academic consensus, at least a defensible, evidence-based working hypothesis that future seasons and outside researchers alike can build upon, test, and potentially refine as additional evidence continues to be recovered from this island's stubbornly persistent mysteries. There's a broader lesson embedded in how this season chose to approach its central question, one that extends beyond the specific attribution claim itself. For most of Oak Island's public history, the biggest question has often been treated implicitly as a search for a single dramatic answer, a name, an organization, a flag that could be planted at the center of the mystery and declared the solution. This season's approach quietly rejects that framing in favor of something more modest but arguably more durable. Not a name, but a tradition, not a flag, but a pattern of evidence consistent enough across enough independent sites to be taken seriously. That distinction may disappoint viewers hoping for a more sensational reveal, the kind of headline-ready answer that has fueled decades of speculation and popular fascination with this island. But it also reflects something the show's own history has taught its producers the hard way, that dramatic single-source claims rarely survive contact with sustained scrutiny, while carefully built, multi-source evidence tends to hold up far better over time. Whether or not this season's specific attribution ultimately proves correct in every detail, the approach it models, patient, comparative, and honest about its own limitations, may end up mattering more than the answer itself. After 2 centuries of dramatic unverified claims, that shift toward patience and evidence may be the real breakthrough this finale represents. The moment the search finally started answering its biggest question, the way it should have from the start, carefully, comparatively, and one confirmed detail at a time, rather than one dramatic claim built to fade the way so many before it have.